In this lesson, we'll take a look at what we mean by imagery, whether it be visual imagery or inner speech. We'll focus on the visual system, though. And before we get to how the working memory system might be involved in imagery, we'll first take a look at how it's involved in perception, just to review. So in the case of vision, we have objects in the world reflecting light. Light will enter the eyes, and then light-sensitive rods and cones here will send electrical signals ultimately down the optic nerve. There's a synapse in the thalamus. Thalamus cells send action potentials up to the visual cortex, and then there's a whole bunch of processing of the visual world going on in the visual cortex. And then we added the component of the working memory system here. We said that the idea is that the visual system has access to frontal cortical cells, right? So if loops of neural activity become generated here, then whatever object was out in the world will enter our working memory, and we will experience, right, the perception of that object. So the contents of working memory are governed by whatever different parts of the brain are involved in those loops of neural activity. And when our attention shifts, the contents of our working memory can shift as well. But in this case, we're paying attention to some object in the world, and we are experiencing a visual perception of that object, and the idea is loops of neural activity are being sustained for as long as we are looking at that object. So that's perception. What about imagery? Because after all, we can look at a pizza in the world and perceive it, but we can also close our eyes and imagine a pizza. We can, in a sense, call up an image of a pizza without having our eyes open. That's called imagery. Well, here the idea then is, instead of the visual system being triggered by the outside world, as it is in perception, that there are internal mechanisms, again in the frontal lobe, that can activate the visual memories, and then again set up loops of neural activity with the working memory system, and so we'll have a visual image. So the difference between perception and imagery has to do with in a sense, the cause of the activation of the visual system. In perception, it's the external world. In visual imagery, it's internal triggers that reactivate visual memories. But again, the working memory system is the system that, in a sense, is involved in both, because in both cases, the visual system will have to be setting up loops of neural activity with the working memory system. Now, in the description I just gave of visual imagery, I mentioned that the same visual areas that are involved in perception are again involved in imagery. And we're going to be explicit about that idea, and we're going to call that the reactivation hypothesis. So let's take a look at perception up here in the top diagram. Here is, again, some loop of neurons that sort of represents the visual image, the memory of what a tree looks like, right? Well, during perception, that set of neurons is activated from the external world, so to speak, right? And so this would be a recognition event. If we have already stored the image of a tree, the memory of what a tree looks like here, then this tree will be activating that memory, and we will set up loops of neural activity, and then we'll have this tree in our working memory system, and we will say, yes, I recognize that's a tree, because the activity of my perception system matches, right, the memory of that same object. So the perceptual system, of course, uses the perceptual areas of the brain. Then in imagery, the idea is that we are reactivating that same memory of a tree, but not from the external world, but internally. So somebody might ask us, what does a tree look like? And that question, of course, enters our working memory. The working memory system and other frontal lobe memory retrieval systems can now reactivate the memory of what a tree looks like and set up those neural loops. So the reactivation hypothesis states that many of the very same areas used in perception are also used in imagery. It's just that during imagery, or during imagination, we are internally activating those memories. But what is common is that we must set up those loops of activity to have the experience of the image. Now, what's the evidence that some of the same areas used in perception are also used in imagery? Well, take a look at the bottom surface of the brain here, and you'll recall that we've studied, there's a region sort of on the bottom part of the temporal lobe there called the fusiform face area. There are other regions of the cortex that seem to respond to bodies and to places, scenes, like of outdoor scenes and things. And they seem to be distinct locations on the surface of the cortex. So brain scanning data indicates that when we look at a face, certain regions of the cortex become highly activated and reliably activated, and those regions are different from when we are looking at a place, right, some kind of visual scene. So when we are perceiving different types of things, different regions of the cortex become preferentially activated. So now, to test the reactivation hypothesis, all you have to do is stick people in the scanners and go ahead and give them visual stimuli to look at, so you can measure what parts of the brain are active during perception, and then ask them to close their eyes and imagine either places or faces or bodies, etc. And sure enough, there is significant overlap in cortical activity between perceiving a place and imagining a place, between perceiving a face and imagining a face. So that supports this idea of the reactivation hypothesis, that many, not all necessarily, but many of the same cortical regions used in perception are also used during imagery. Another kind of evidence comes from lesion studies. So you recall that some of those areas, like the face area, can be damaged in patients, and that leads to prosopagnosia, face blindness. And the interesting thing about face blindness is not only do the patients have difficulty perceiving faces, but they have difficulty imagining faces, right? So again, those are the two aspects of the reactivation hypothesis, that the same neural elements are used in perception and imagination. Well, if you damage the region that is involved in perception of faces, you would predict then that there would be difficulty imagining faces. And that's the kind of finding that neuroscientists find. So both brain scanning data and lesion data supports the reactivation hypothesis, that there's an overlap in the neural tissue involved in perception and imagination.